My children disowned me in court, so I revealed a family secret that shattered their silence. It was a truth I had kept buried for years, holding a power strong enough to erase every accusation thrown at me. I held my tongue, yet within me burned the secret I had carried for so long, a truth capable of changing everything. They believed the matter was finished, but they never realized it was only waiting for its moment to rise, and when it did, no amount of pride or denial could stand against it. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I remember the day so vividly, as if the courthouse itself held its breath, waiting for me to collapse under the weight of their betrayal. The room was silent, except for the clicking of pens, the shuffling of legal papers, and the confident footsteps of my children as they took the stand against me. My son looked me in the eye with a coldness I had never seen before, and my daughter, the child I had raised with tears and sleepless nights, avoided my gaze altogether. When the judge asked if they were prepared to make their claims official, their voices did not tremble. With the arrogance of youth and the persuasion of greed behind them, they said the words that cut deeper than any knife. They declared that I was no longer fit to control my own estate, that I had lost my right to the legacy I had built with my own blood and sweat, and that they wanted me removed from every decision regarding the family assets. I sat there stunned, my hands gripping the edges of the wooden bench until my knuckles turned white. How could the children I carried through storms of hardship now carry daggers meant only for me? How could the faces I once kissed goodnight, the voices that once called me father with warmth and trust, now turn those same voices into cold accusations? My heart raced, but my mind wandered back to the countless years of sacrifice. The years I spent bent over machinery in dimly lit workshops. The endless days where I worked double shifts so my daughter could attend college. The hours I saved and scrimped so my son could pursue the career he dreamed of. None of those sacrifices mattered in that courtroom. In their eyes, I was just an old man standing in the way of their inheritance. The betrayal was not born from misunderstanding. It was orchestrated. I knew the hand behind it, the whisper that poisoned their hearts, the influence of the man who had married into my family and believed himself clever enough to dismantle me. My son-in-law stood tall that day, smirking as if victory had already been sealed. He thought I was broken, a relic too weary to fight back. He thought he had silenced me by turning my own children against me. What he did not realize was that in trying to erase me, he had lit the fire that would expose him. I stayed silent that day, choosing not to lash out, not to plead, not to beg. Silence became my armor. In silence, I watched. In silence, I calculated. And in silence, I remembered that there was one truth, one secret buried deep within our family history that no amount of manipulation could hide. I had kept it hidden all these years, believing it was better to let sleeping ghosts remain buried, but now I understood that it was not just a secret. It was a weapon, a sword of truth sharpened by time, waiting for the right moment to be drawn. As the gavel echoed, sealing their declaration of disownment, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. They believed they had won. They believed the father who had raised them, the man who had carried them through the darkest storms, was finally powerless. But I knew differently. My story was only beginning. What they had unleashed was not the end of my legacy, but the opening act of a revelation they could never prepare for. And when the truth came, it would not be whispered. It would thunder through the courtroom so loudly that even the proud son-in-law, the man who thought himself untouchable, would crumble beneath it. So I sat in that courtroom, outwardly silent, inwardly roaring, carrying a secret that would soon erupt like fire. And when it did, it would not only restore my dignity, but it would remind everyone watching that truth always waits for its day, and mine was coming sooner than they could ever imagine. The courtroom was heavy with tension, the kind of weight that clings to your chest and makes every breath a reminder that something sacred is about to be shattered. And as I sat on that stiff wooden bench, I felt more like a stranger at my own trial than a father whose only crime was giving too much of himself to the very children now standing against me. Their voices firm and their eyes devoid of the warmth I once knew. I could hear the rustle of papers, the polished shoes of attorneys pacing, the shuffle of spectators leaning forward to catch every word. And then came the moment that would forever scar my memory, the moment my son stood tall in the witness box, adjusted his tie with the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won, and declared that I was incapable of managing my own affairs, that I was reckless with the estate, that I was no longer the father who had raised him, but rather a liability needed to be stripped of authority. His words slicing through me like sharpened glass, while my daughter, sitting beside her husband with her chin held high, nodded in agreement, and spoke of me as though I were a burden to be carried rather than the man who once carried her through sleepless nights of fever and childhood fears. I tried to meet her gaze, hoping to find even a flicker of hesitation, but all I saw was the cold reflection of her husband's influence, the smirk curling at the edges of his lips as he leaned back in satisfaction, knowing he had orchestrated this betrayal with careful precision, poisoning their minds until they believed every lie he fed them. And as the judge listened with narrowed eyes, scribbling notes on the thick file before him, I felt my dignity stripped piece by piece, not by the law, but by the very voices that once called me father with love, now calling me unfit, incapable, and undeserving. And I sat frozen in silence, my heart pounding so loud I wondered if the entire room could hear it, while my mind drifted to the memories of birthdays I paid for, graduations I celebrated, and milestones I sacrificed everything to provide, all of it erased in a single afternoon where the people I loved most in the world stood united with a man who never worked for what he had, but believed he was entitled to everything I had built. And though humiliation wrapped itself around me like chains, though anger simmered beneath my ribs begging to erupt, I forced myself to stay still, to let them speak, because in their arrogance they believed the battle was won. But I knew a war is never decided in the first strike, and as the gavel echoed at the end of the session, I whispered silently to myself that the truth I carried would not only restore the dignity they tried to strip from me, but would leave them trembling when they realized the father they had dismissed was far from finished. For this was not the end of my story, but the bitter beginning of a reckoning none of them could escape. When I look back on the long years that brought me to that courtroom, I cannot help but feel the ache of every sacrifice that defined my existence. For mine was not a life of luxury or comfort, but one of relentless toil, sleepless nights, and endless responsibilities that I shouldered alone after fate decided to take my wife far too early, leaving me to raise our children with only the strength of my hands and the stubbornness of my will. And though I was broken with grief, I promised myself and her memory that I would not let our children suffer or fall behind. So I worked like a man possessed, taking on 2, sometimes 3 jobs at once, fixing machinery in cold warehouses before the sun rose, driving trucks through the night when the city slept, and spending every ounce of my energy ensuring that the roof over their heads never leaked, the food on their plates was warm, and their futures shone brighter than the dim corners of my reality. And even when my body ached so badly, I thought my bones would snap, I pressed forward because I knew they depended on me, and when I watched them sleep, their faces soft and innocent, I told myself that my suffering was worth it if it meant their dreams could grow unbroken. So when the years passed, and they grew into young adults with ambitions larger than my tired pockets could handle, I did not hesitate to sell what little I had saved to pay for their schooling, my son's university fees swallowing my wages whole, my daughter's apartment rent pulling the last coins from my wallet. Yet I never once complained, never once reminded them, the price I paid, because I believed that was a father's duty, to give until nothing was left and to smile through the emptiness. And when they graduated, when they stood in gowns I had paid for and shook hands with deans and professors, my chest swelled with pride, even though my bank account was empty. And when weddings came, I poured every drop of sweat and penny of savings into deposits for venues, rings, and down payments on houses, watching from the shadows as they thanked others for the beauty of their celebrations, while I stood silent, my pockets lighter but my heart content, because I thought they were happy. Yet what I did not see was how my sacrifices became invisible to them, how each check I wrote, each loan I covered, and each grocery bill I paid became something they no longer saw as love but as obligation. And while I worked to give them more, I gave up my own dreams, never traveling, never buying the car I wanted, never repairing the house in ways I wished, always telling myself that tomorrow would be my turn. Though tomorrow never arrived, because the next emergency always came, whether it was a broken-down car for my son, a semester fee for my daughter, or an unexpected bill they could not handle. And I always answered, always found a way. Sometimes pawning the few keepsakes of my youth, or taking loans under my name, because their well-being mattered more than my comfort. And through all of this, I believed my devotion would one day be remembered, that perhaps they would look back and see the miles I walked with holes in my shoes so they could ride in comfort, the hours I spent bent over machines so they could sit in classrooms, the dreams I buried so they could live theirs. But as I sat in that courtroom, listening to them deny me, I realized that years of sacrifice had not taught them gratitude, it had only taught them to expect more, and that bitter truth struck me harder than any gavel or judgment. Yet I also knew that while they had forgotten, I had not, and the record of my sacrifice was written in every scar on my hands, every line on my face, and every sleepless night endured for their sake. And though they may deny me in words, they could never erase the truth of a life spent giving, and that truth would soon find its voice when the moment was right, because even the heaviest sacrifices carry a power that time and arrogance cannot silence. As I trace the years from their childhood into the adults they became, I can now see how the seeds of ingratitude were planted slowly and subtly, watered not only by the comforts I provided, but also by the whispers of greed and the false promises that grew louder once my daughter married a man who believed money was the only measure of worth. And I remember when they were small, how their eyes lit up at the simplest joys, a toy train made of wood, a cake baked with what little I could afford, and how they hugged me tightly, as though I had given them the world. But as the years passed and the world around them expanded, so too did their desires, shifting from simple joys to endless demands, from gratitude to expectation, and at first I dismissed it as the natural hunger of youth, convincing myself that it was only a phase and that they would learn humility with time. Yet instead of fading, it deepened. For each time I gave, they learned not to appreciate, but to assume. And I saw it clearly when my son asked for money to cover his first car, promising to pay me back once he secured a steady job, a promise that dissolved like mist the moment he held the keys in his hand. And I saw it again when my daughter demanded that her wedding be lavish, insisting on venues beyond my means and dresses that carried price tags higher than months of my wages. And though I stretched myself thin to give her the day she wanted, the words of thanks were shallow, quickly replaced by complaints that something could have been grander. And in those moments, I began to understand that my sacrifices were no longer seen as gifts, but as obligations, as though it was my duty to meet every whim simply because I was their father. And it hurt deeply to watch their entitlement bloom. But the worst of it came when my son-in-law stepped into the picture, a man with polished shoes and a sharpened tongue, who looked at me not as a father-in-law but as an obstacle, a gatekeeper to the wealth he believed should be his, and it was he who fed their vanity, whispering that they deserved more, that my sacrifices were nothing compared to what they could gain if only I stepped aside. And slowly I saw my children's eyes turn colder, their words sharper, their laughter at my modest ways tinged with disdain. And though I tried to ignore it, though I tried to tell myself that love would outlast greed, their behavior grew more dismissive, more entitled, until even the smallest gesture from me was treated as insufficient, and the more I gave, the less they valued me. For what once was a blessing had become invisible, and what once was a father's love had become to them a resource to exploit. And I will never forget the sting of overhearing my son brag to his friends about how I always bailed him out, not with gratitude in his tone, but with pride, as though my sacrifices were his entitlement by birthright. And I will never forget the look on my daughter's face when she told me that the life I had lived was nothing more than survival, while her husband promised her riches and luxury, as though love and sacrifice had no value unless wrapped in gold. And it was in those years, long before the courtroom, that I began to see the slow erosion of respect. The crumbling of the bond I thought unbreakable, yet blinded by love I continued to give, continued to hope they would see the truth, never realizing that entitlement is a vine that once it takes root will strangle everything in its path. And by the time I stood in front of the judge, the seeds planted long ago had grown into towering weeds of arrogance and greed. But little did they know that beneath the soil of their assumptions I had buried a secret they could not deny, a secret that would turn the garden of their illusions into ashes when revealed at the right time. When I sit and measure the countless ways my money flowed from my hands into theirs, I realize that every stage of their lives was built upon the silent foundatio and of my sacrifices. For from the moment they stepped into school, I was there signing checks for tuition, covering book fees, and ensuring they never once had to stand in a cafeteria line with empty pockets. And when my son reached college age, I remember the sting of cashing out the last of my savings bonds I had held onto for decades as the only cushion for my own future, because I wanted him to walk across that stage one day without the weight of debt on his shoulders. And when he asked for help with an internship in another city, I did not hesitate to wire him the money for rent and food, telling him to focus on building his career while I worked extra shifts to cover my own bills. And when my daughter declared she wanted to pursue a degree in design, I swallowed my doubts about affording it and borrowed against my modest retirement fund, promising myself that it would all come back in pride when I saw her flourish. And beyond education, there were the daily threads of financial support woven so tightly into their lives that they never even noticed, like the envelopes of cash I slipped into their hands when they were first married, or the weeks of groceries I paid for because they claimed money was tight, or the countless utility bills I settled to keep their lights on while my own house remained dim. And when my daughter's wedding day approached, I remember writing checks with trembling hands, covering the venue deposit, the catering, the flowers, and even the deposit for the house they moved into afterward, all while she smiled at her husband as though he alone, made her dreams possible, never acknowledging that her father had sold a piece of land he swore he would never part with just to give her the start she demanded. And I think of the car payments I made when my son said he needed reliable transportation for his job, how I signed my name as guarantor when the bank would not approve him, and how I stood silently in the background when he proudly told others he had bought the car himself. And even as the years rolled forward and I grew older, even as my back bent further from decades of work, they still came with outstretched hands, asking for loans that were never repaid, for bailouts that were never acknowledged, and for investments into schemes pitched by my son-in-law that I knew were foolish but agreed to because my daughter's pleading eyes begged me not to disappoint her. And through all of this I told myself that it was love, that a father is supposed to give without keeping score. But in the quiet of my nights, I kept the silent ledger, the memories of every check signed, every bill paid, every dollar scraped from my meager earnings, and the weight of it all could fill libraries. Yet in the courtroom, when they stood there declaring that I was unfit to manage what remained of my estate, not one of them remembered, not one of them acknowledged the river of money that had carried them this far. And in that moment, I understood the cruel irony that the very thread of financial support I had woven into their lives had become invisible because entitlement blinds the heart to generosity. And though they dismissed me as a burden, though they painted me as incapable, I knew the truth of my contributions, and I also knew that the secret I guarded, tied to the very fabric of our family's finances, would one day unravel their arrogance and leave them facing the undeniable proof of how much they owed not only in money but in loyalty. And that day was drawing closer with every arrogant word they spoke against me. The day the letter arrived, I remember my hands trembling, not because the paper was heavy, but because the words it carried pressed on me like the weight of 1,000 stones. For it was not an ordinary letter, but a legal summons written in stiff language that felt colder than ice, instructing me to appear in court at the request of my very own children. And as I unfolded it slowly at the kitchen table, where I had so often counted pennies to pay their bills and prepared meals to keep them fed, my eyes blurred as I tried to understand how it had come to this, how the same children I had carried on my shoulders when they were small, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose tears I had kissed away, were now dragging me into a courtroom to demand that I surrender everything I had built, accusing me of mismanagement and incompetence. And as I read the claims, words crafted with precision but dripping with contempt, I could almost hear the voice of my son-in-law behind them, the lawyerly phrasing, the accusations sharpened not from genuine concern but from a hunger for control. And though my chest tightened with grief, another feeling soon rose within me, suspicion. A gnawing thought that this was never truly about them believing I could not manage. It was about them being manipulated, about someone whispering in their ears that my estate was theirs to seize if only they pushed me out. And in that moment I felt the hollowness of my home, every corner echoing with memories of love now tainted by betrayal. Yet I could not allow myself to crumble, not yet, because I needed to understand the depth of this attack. So I read every line again, tracing each accusation as though it were a blade pressed against my throat. And though my hands shook, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, whispering to myself that this was not the end but the beginning of a battle I never asked for but one I could not avoid. And that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the years of giving, the endless nights of sacrifice and the countless ways I had supported them, and I asked myself how they could so easily forget, how they could so quickly turn love into litigation. But beneath the ache of that question was the growing certainty that the answer lay not in their hearts alone, but in the influence of the man who had always looked at me with disdain. A man who saw my age as weakness and my generosity as foolishness, a man who believed he could rewrite the story of my life by turning my own blood against me, and as sleep refused to come, I realized that the summons was more than just paper. It was a declaration of war. And though they thought I was too broken to resist, they had underestimated the resolve of a father who had spent decades fighting for his family. For if I could endure the loss of my wife, the endless years of raising 2 children alone, and the crushing weight of sacrifice, then I could endure this too. And as the dawn broke and light spilled through my window, I rose with weary bones but steady hands, telling myself that I would walk into that courtroom not as a defeated man, but as a father, armed with truths they had long forgotten, truths that could not be erased by accusations or twisted by manipulation. And though they believed this summons would be the beginning of my downfall, it would in time prove to be the spark that lit a fire neither they nor their scheming son-in-law could ever hope to control. It was a few days after I received the summons when the veil over their true intentions finally lifted. And though I had suspected manipulation from the start, nothing could have prepared me for the sting of hearing it confirmed with my own ears. For I had gone to my daughter's house in the hope of speaking to her directly, to remind her of the bond we once shared, to plead with her to remember the years when it was just the 3 of us against the world. But instead of finding reconciliation, I found myself standing outside her window, the curtain slightly ajar, their voices floating into the night as clear as a confession. And what I heard that evening burned deeper into my heart than the sharpest blade, because there they were, my children, laughing with my son-in-law, mocking the very man who had built their lives brick by brick, dismissing me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle. And with every word they spoke, I understood more of the poison that had spread through them. For my son scoffed and said it would not be long before the house I lived in would be theirs, that the judge would believe them, because old men rarely win against the voices of the young, and my daughter, her laughter more cutting than her words, declared that once I was stripped of control, they would finally be free to enjoy what was rightfully theirs without having to beg me for handouts, while my son-in-law leaned back in his chair and with the confidence of a predator spoke about my estate as though it were already signed into his hands, boasting that he had convinced them I was too frail, too old, and too confused to manage anything of value. And they believed him. They truly believed that I was a man past his time, incapable of defending myself. And as I stood frozen outside that window, I realized that this was never about love, never about care. It was about greed, pure and simple, greed dressed in the fine clothing of legal language and disguised as concern. And though my stomach churned with grief at their cruelty, another feeling soon took its place, a cold clarity that settled into my bones. Because in that moment I understood their motives completely. They wanted my property, they wanted my assets, they wanted the life I had built with sweat and pain without ever having to lift a finger, and they were convinced that the courtroom would be their stage, and I would be the fool left defenseless. Yet what they did not know was that I had listened, I had heard their words, and in hearing them I found a strength I thought I had lost. For while they celebrated what they believed was already theirs, I began to map out in my mind the path that would bring them to face the truth, and I swore quietly in the shadows that their arrogance would not go unchallenged, their greed would not go unanswered, and that the very secret I had carried in silence for decades would become the hammer that shattered their illusions. For they may have stripped me of dignity in public, they may have mocked me in private, but they had also revealed themselves fully to me, and once a mask is torn away, it can never be put back on. So I turned away from that window with a heart heavier than it had ever been, but with a resolve sharper than it had ever felt. Because now I was no longer a father merely grieving his children's betrayal. I was a man preparing to remind them of truths they could never escape, truths that no denial, no arrogance, and no manipulation could ever silence. In the days that followed, I found myself consumed by an ocean of grief, waves of sorrow crashing over me. Each time I remembered the sound of their laughter as they spoke about my life, as though it were a prize to be divided, and for many nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence of my home pressing on me like a weight too heavy to bear, and I wondered how a man who had given so much could be cast aside with such ease, how children who once clung to my legs for comfort could now plot to strip me of everything. Yet while the grief threatened to drown me, I discovered within it a stillness, a strange clarity that had been absent for years. Because as much as it hurt to know that my love had been forgotten, the pain hardened into something else, something colder, and as the nights dragged on without rest, I realized that my tears were drying, my hands were steadying, and my heart was no longer simply breaking but reshaping itself into steel. And with each sunrise I rose not weaker but stronger, more determined to face the storm they had unleashed, because I understood now that pleading with them for love or reminding them of my sacrifices would change nothing. They had already chosen their path, but I too had a path, and mine would be forged not from emotion but from resolve, a resolve to uncover the truth, to shine a light so bright that even their arrogance could not stand against it. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table one morning, the same table where I once helped them with homework, my hands folded tightly as I whispered aloud to the empty room that I would not fight with anger, I would not crumble with despair, I would fight with patience, with strategy, and with truth. And as those words left my mouth, I felt a strange peace, as though the burden of begging for their loyalty had been lifted, leaving only the clarity of purpose. And so I began to change, no longer a man waiting to be humiliated, but a man quietly preparing for a reckoning, moving with calm precision, hiding my intentions beneath a mask of silence. And I carried myself in public as though I were defeated, because I knew they believed I was finished, and I let them believe it, for their overconfidence would be the very rope they tied around their own necks. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw not the frail old man they imagined, but a father who had endured storms they could never understand, a man who had raised a family with nothing but willpower. And if I had survived all that, then I could survive this, and more than survive, I could prevail. So while the world thought I was broken, within me a fire was rekindling, a fire fueled not by revenge, but by the need to show them that truth still matters, that a man's worth cannot be erased by greed. And as I sat in the quiet of my home, each night turning into dawn, my resolve grew sharper, my steps steadier, until I no longer feared the courtroom or the accusations, because I knew that patience is a weapon sharper than any blade, and mine was ready. And when the time came, I would reveal what I had kept hidden for so long, and that revelation would be my answer, my justice, my unshakable truth. W.A.N. I finally accepted that love alone would not shield me from the storm gathering around me. I knew I could no longer face this battle as a grieving father, but had to rise as a man prepared to defend the truth, and that meant finding someone who could help me navigate the labyrinth of lies and manipulation that my son-in-law had spun so expertly. So I turned to the one thing they never expected me to have: professional allies. And though I had always been a man who relied on his own strength, building my life with calloused hands and stubborn endurance, I understood that this fight required tools I did not possess. So I visited an old friend who recommended a lawyer known not for theatrics, but for sharp precision. A woman whose reputation in the courtroom was built on unshakable professionalism and a refusal to be intimidated. And when I first sat across from her in her quiet office, the weight of my years heavy on my shoulders, she looked at me not with pity, but with respect. And that alone reminded me that I was not as powerless as they believed, for as I laid out the story of my sacrifices, the summons, and the cruel laughter I had overheard, her pen moved swiftly across the page, her eyes narrowing with each detail. And when I finished, she leaned forward and told me plainly that men like my son-in-law thrive on arrogance and lies, but lies always leave trails that can be uncovered by those who know where to look. And so we agreed that while she prepared the legal defense, she would also introduce me to an investigator, a man who had spent decades tracing hidden accounts, forged signatures, and secret deals. And when I met him, I was struck by how quietly he spoke, yet how sharp his questions were, because he did not waste time with sympathy. He wanted dates, receipts, copies of checks, bank statements, and every scrap of evidence that could reveal the truth buried beneath their accusations. And I provided him with everything I had: boxes of old records stacked in my attic, faded receipts tucked into drawers, and even letters I had kept over the years from times when I had bailed them out financially, all of it placed into his careful hands. And as the days passed, I began to feel a shift inside me, for no longer was I alone in this battle. I had allies, competent and relentless, who saw the injustice for what it was, and treated my case not as a hopeless struggle, but as a challenge to be won. And while my children and their husband likely believed I was sitting at home defeated, I was in fact meeting in quiet offices, reviewing strategies, and learning how to wield the truth as a weapon. And in those moments I felt the weight of years lift just slightly, because now it was not only my resolve, but also their skill that stood against the tide. And each night, when I returned home to the silence of my house, I no longer felt crushed by loneliness. I felt steadied by the knowledge that for the first time in years, I was no longer simply enduring. I was preparing, I was fighting back, and with every new discovery my lawyer and investigator uncovered, I could see the arrogance of my son-in-law crumbling in my imagination, for the truth was not only on my side, it was being sharpened by professionals who knew how to reveal it in ways he could never deny. And though they believed I was a man cornered and alone, what they could not see was that I had quietly built a team who would help me dismantle the falsehoods piece by piece, until all that remained was the undeniable evidence of their greed and my vindication. As the weeks unfolded, and my lawyer and investigator continued to piece together the lies that surrounded me, I found myself revisiting memories I had locked away for decades, memories tied to a secret so carefully guarded that even my children had no knowledge of it. And as I sat in my quiet home, surrounded by stacks of papers and fading photographs, I realized that the time might finally be approaching when silence would no longer protect, but only harm. For while my children thought they held every card in their hands, while my son-in-law strutted around as though he had already claimed my estate, I carried within me a truth that had the power to upend their illusions completely, a truth not born of money or property, but of blood and history. And though I had always told myself that revealing it would cause too much pain, I now understood that greater pain was being inflicted by their greed. And so I began to prepare myself for the possibility of unveiling what I had never dared to speak aloud. For this secret was not just mine, it was a thread woven into the fabric of our family, a truth that had the strength to redraw the lines they were so eager to erase. And I remember sitting in the dim light of my living room one night, running my fingers across an old envelope sealed shut for years, an envelope that contained the proof of what I knew. And as I held it in my trembling hands, I felt both the burden of the past and the promise of justice, because within those papers was a revelation that would shift the balance of power in ways they could not predict. And while I did not yet speak of it to my lawyer, I hinted at its existence, telling her that there were truths about our family that had never been spoken, truths that could alter the case entirely. And I will never forget how she looked at me then, her eyes sharp and calculating, urging me to consider carefully, reminding me that secrets hold power not only when revealed, but also when withheld until the right moment. And her words echoed in my mind as I weighed the cost, knowing that once I chose to unveil it, there would be no return to the silence that had protected us for so long. Yet at the same time, I felt a growing certainty that this was why I had endured, why I had been given the strength to survive so many years of sacrifice. Because perhaps the secret was not meant to remain hidden forever. Perhaps it was meant to serve as the unshakable proof when all else failed. And so I tucked the envelope back into its place, resolved that the day would come when I would lay it before the court and strip away the lies they had woven. And until then I carried it within me like a hidden blade, unseen but ready. And I could not help but feel a grim sense of irony, knowing that while they laughed behind my back, while they conspired to paint me as weak and incapable, I was holding the very truth that would silence their laughter, a truth they could never deny no matter how hard they tried. And in the quiet of that night I whispered to myself that patience would be my ally, for when the right moment came, the secret would not just speak, it would roar, and its voice would echo so loudly that even the arrogant man who thought he had stripped me of everything would be forced to lower his head in the face of reality. The deeper my lawyer and investigator dug, the more the truth began to surface in fragments like bones unearthed from the soil, each discovery sharper than the last. And though my children and their proud husband believed their accusations were airtight, believing they had painted me into a corner from which there was no escape, they had underestimated how greed always leaves behind footprints. And it was those very footprints that my allies were now following with relentless focus. And I will never forget the day the investigator arrived at my home with a stack of photocopies, his quiet voice carrying more weight than thunder as he laid them on the table, page after page of forged documents, false signatures that pretended to be mine but were sloppily traced, loans taken in my name without my knowledge, debts hidden beneath layers of deceit. And when I looked at those papers, my hands shook not with fear, but with a mixture of anger and relief. Anger that my trust had been violated so cruelly, relief that the evidence was no longer just in my heart but in ink and numbers that no judge could ignore. And as he walked me through the details, I saw how carefully the son-in-law had orchestrated everything, how he had whispered lies into my children's ears while secretly pulling money from accounts, rerouting assets into ventures that were already crumbling, and it became painfully clear that his plan had never been about protecting the family. It had always been about bleeding me dry until there was nothing left to fight over. And though my children may have been blind to it, though they believed they were acting out of their own will, the truth was that they had been manipulated, their loyalty poisoned by a man who saw them not as people to love, but as tools to get to me. And the irony of it all was that in their eagerness to betray me, they had tied themselves to the very fraud that would expose them. Because, as the investigator pointed out, the forged documents carried their names too, their signatures appearing on agreements they claimed to understand, but likely never read. And the paper trail wove a story far darker than even I had imagined, a story of financial theft and manipulation so tangled that the only way to bring clarity was to shine the light of truth directly onto it in court. And when I handed those papers to my lawyer, her eyes lit with the quiet confidence of a soldier handed a weapon, because now we were no longer defending against empty accusations. Now we were preparing to launch an attack grounded in undeniable proof. And I remember sitting back in my chair that night, staring at the evidence spread across my table, realizing that what they had tried to use against me would soon become the very chains that bound them, because lies written on paper may deceive for a while, but truth written on paper lasts forever. And as I gathered the files into neat stacks, I whispered to myself that every sleepless night, every insult, every humiliation in that courtroom would soon be answered, not with anger, not with shouting, but with these pages that told the real story. And while they still laughed in their arrogance, I prepared in silence, knowing that when the day came to present the paper trail, it would unravel their schemes completely and leave them scrambling for excuses in front of the very judge they thought was already theirs to control. There are nights when I cannot stop my mind from wandering back to the moment everything changed, to the day I lost my wife and the life we had built together collapsed into silence. And as I sit in the quiet now preparing for battles in court, I am often pulled back to that hospital room where the air was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines, where I held her frail hand in mine and promised her with every tear in my body that I would raise our children with love, that I would give them the life she dreamed of giving them. And when her hand slipped from mine and the monitors went still, I felt the weight of fatherhood fall entirely on my shoulders, a weight I carried every single day from that moment forward. And though I was broken, I rose each morning to make their breakfasts, to pack their school bags, to mend their clothes when they tore them playing outside, and I taught myself to braid my daughter's hair the way her mother once did, fumbling at first but learning because I wanted her to feel the same care. And I learned to speak softly to my son when the nightmares came, telling him stories, until he fell back asleep, and I sacrificed sleep, comfort, and even my health to keep my promise to the woman I loved. And as the years passed and the children grew taller, I buried my grief beneath work and duty, building walls around the hole in my heart so that they would never feel the emptiness that consumed me. And I remember the milestones with a bittersweet ache. My daughter's first school recital, where I sat in the front row holding back tears because, say, her mother was not there to see it. My son's first soccer game, where I cheered louder than anyone because I knew he needed to feel the presence of both parents in one. And every time they achieved something, I whispered quietly to my wife's memory that I had kept my promise, that I had done what I said I would. And yet, as I sit here now, betrayed in court by the very children I poured my soul into, the memory of that promise slices deeper than any legal accusation, because I remember how certain I was that love and sacrifice would be enough, that they would grow up knowing how much I had given, But perhaps what hurts the most is not just their rejection, but the realization that the woman I loved will never know how far we fell. She will never hear the cruel words they spoke in court. She will never see the greed that took root in their hearts, and I am almost grateful for that, because if she had lived to see this day, it would have broken her spirit beyond repair. And so I sit in the silence of my home and allow myself to remember her face, her voice, her laughter echoing in the halls of the house we built. And I remind myself that my strength comes not from the children who have forgotten, but from the vow I made at her bedside. And even though they no longer see me as a father worth honoring, I know that if she were here, she would stand beside me. She would remind me that love and truth always outlast greed, and it is in that memory, in that flashback, to the most painful day of my life, that I find the courage to keep moving forward, because my fight is not only for myself, it is for the vow I made long ago, a vow that binds me to her even now. And as I prepare to face them in court again, I whisper to her memory that I will not falter, I will not let lies triumph, and I will see this battle through to the end. The days leading up to the next court hearing were some of the longest of my life, each one filled with a quiet tension that pressed on my chest like an invisible weight. And while the world outside moved on with its usual rhythm, my home became a war room where every detail of my life was examined, every record sifted through, and every memory replayed as if it were evidence waiting to be tested. And though my lawyer assured me that we were making progress, I could not help but feel the gravity of what lay ahead, for I was not only defending myself in a legal battle, I was defending the truth of a lifetime against the lies of my own children and the manipulations of the man who stood at their side. And each night, when I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of documents, old photographs, faded receipts, and letters I had kept over the years, I felt the weight of history pressing against me, because these were not just papers. They were fragments of my sacrifices, proof of the life I had built and the love I had poured into them, and as I sorted through them one by one, my hands trembling with both age and emotion, I forced myself to stay steady, reminding myself that this was not the time to grieve, but the time to prepare. And I remember my lawyer visiting one evening, spreading the papers across the table and organizing them into neat folders, her voice calm and precise as she explained how each piece would be used, how the bank statement showed the loans I had covered, how the receipts tied directly to their education, and how the photographs would remind the co-heir of the family we once were, a family held together not by wealth but by sacrifice. And then there was the envelope, the one I had guarded for decades, the one containing the secret that could change everything, and though I had not yet handed it over to her, I placed it on the table that night and told her only that when the time came it would be revealed, and she looked at me with an expression that mixed curiosity with trust, urging me to decide carefully, reminding me that timing was everything, and so I tucked it back away, my resolve deepening, for I knew that the secret was my final card, one that could not be wasted too soon. And as the night stretched into morning, I sat alone, staring at the folders we had prepared, whispering to myself that I was ready, that I would walk into that courtroom not as a broken old man, but as a father who had endured, a man carrying the truth. And though fear still gnawed at the edges of my mind, I pushed it aside with the certainty that this time I would not be blindsided. This time I would be the one to strike, and with every day that passed the tension grew sharper like the tightening of a bowstring, and I carried myself with the calmness of someone who knew that the silence before the storm was not weakness but power. And when the morning of the hearing finally arrived, I rose with steady hands, dressed in the same suit I had worn at my daughter's wedding, and looked in the mirror at a face lined with years of sacrifice and sorrow, and I told that reflection that today I would not be humiliated. Today I would not be stripped of dignity. Today I would stand in the light of truth and let the evidence speak louder than their accusations. And as I gathered the folders and tucked them into my briefcase, I felt the stillness of resolve settle over me. And though the battle was far from over, I was no longer walking into that courtroom alone. I was walking in with preparation, with allies, and with the undeniable proof that would soon shake the foundation of every lie they had built against me. When I walked back into the courtroom on the morning of the next hearing, the air itself felt different, charged with a kind of electricity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand. And as I took my seat at the long wooden table, I could feel every pair of eyes pressing against me, some filled with curiosity, some with pity, and some with judgment. And yet none of those stares carried the weight of the two I knew best, the eyes of my children who sat on the opposite side with their lawyer and their smug confidence radiating like a shield around them. And though I searched their faces for even a flicker of hesitation, I found nothing but the same cold resolve I had seen before, a resolve that was not theirs alone, but carefully constructed by the man sitting proudly between them, my son-in-law, who leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, his lips curling into that familiar smirk that told me he believed victory was already sealed. And as the judge entered the room and the murmurs died down, the tension thickened until even the sound of papers being shuffled seemed loud, and I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me because I knew that today was not just another hearing. Today was the stage upon which the real battle would begin. And as their lawyer rose to speak, his words dripping with rehearsed confidence, he painted me as a frail old man, incapable of managing my own estate, repeating the accusations that I had been careless, reckless, and unfit to oversee the wealth I had built, and each sentence echoed like an insult carved into stone. And though I sat silently, my lawyer beside me scribbling notes with calm precision, I felt the anger rising in my chest like fire, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to remain still, for I knew that patience would serve me better than outrage. And when my daughter leaned forward to whisper something to her husband, both of them chuckling quietly as though they had already triumphed, I tightened my grip on the edge of the table, reminding myself that their arrogance would be their undoing. Because what they did not realize was that every minute of this proceeding brought us closer to the moment when their lies would collapse. And though the judge's expression remained unreadable, I caught small shifts in his posture, the narrowing of his eyes, the slight frown as he listened, and it gave me hope that not all was lost, that the truth might still find fertile ground in this place. And as the hours stretched on with arguments tossed back and forth, the courtroom became suffocating with tension, like a storm waiting to break. And though my children never once looked at me directly, their words stabbed all the same, my son insisting I was incapable of handling even the simplest decisions, my daughter accusing me of misusing funds, and all the while my son-in-law nodded approvingly, his presence dominating their every statement, as if he were the true voice behind their accusations. And by the time the judge called for a recess, my body ached with the strain of sitting so long under the weight of their contempt, but my mind was sharper than ever, because I knew the storm was only just beginning, and soon it would be my turn, and when it came, the patience I had clung to would be rewarded, because beneath the calm surface I carried the truth like thunder building in the distance, ready to strike when the moment was right. The moment finally arrived, when the courtroom shifted from their endless accusations to my chance to speak, and as I rose from my chair, the weight of every sacrifice, every insult, and every sleepless night pressed against me, Yet instead of breaking me, it straightened my back and steadied my voice, and I looked at the judge, then at my children, then finally at the man who had orchestrated it all, my son-in-law. And I knew that what I was about to say would change everything, for while they expected me to falter, to stumble over excuses, or plead for sympathy, I gave them neither. Instead, I placed a sealed envelope on the table and asked that it be submitted as evidence, my lawyer sliding it forward with calm precision. And as the judge opened it, his eyes scanning the papers inside, the room grew so silent I could hear the faint hum of the lights above, and then I began to speak, my voice clear and steady, telling the court that while I had endured accusations of incompetence and mismanagement, the truth was that it was not I who had failed to manage, it was the man sitting across from me who had manipulated, deceived, and hidden more than anyone realized. And I asked the judge to look carefully at the documents, because within them lay proof that my son-in-law had concealed a life he never intended to reveal, a life that included a child born from another woman during his marriage to my daughter, a child he had secretly supported with funds siphoned from accounts tied to my estate, and I watched as my daughter's face went pale, her lips parting in disbelief, as the word S settled over her like a crushing weight, and my son shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the man they had trusted more than their own father. And the judge's expression hardened as he read aloud portions of the documents, bank transfers traced directly to the woman and child, signatures that tied my son-in-law's name to hidden accounts, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs, whispers spreading like wildfire as the truth thundered through the silence. And though my son-in-law tried to maintain his smug composure, I saw the sweat forming at his brow, the twitch of his jaw, as he realized the fortress of lies he had built was crumbling brick by brick in front of everyone. And I continued, explaining how the very asset he had attempted to seize in my name, the property he claimed was rightfully theirs, was in fact entangled in legal protections I had established years earlier, protections that ensured it could only pass to family bound by loyalty and truth, not by deception and fraud. And with every word I spoke I felt my dignity returning, not because I sought revenge, but because the truth was finally being heard. And as my lawyer laid out the paper trail, connecting the hidden debts, the forged signatures, and the evidence of manipulation, I turned to my children and spoke directly to them, reminding them of the man I had been all their lives, the sacrifices they had forgotten, the love they had dismissed. And I told them that while they may have declared in court that I was no longer their father, no amount of words could erase the truth of blood and history, and now they would see that the man they had chosen to side with was nothing more than a liar who used them to cover his own shame. And as the judge called for order, slamming his gavel to quiet the eruption of voices, I sat back down with steady hands, my heart pounding but my soul lighter, because the secret I had guarded for so long had finally been revealed, and in that single moment the entire balance of the case shifted, leaving them stunned and me standing not as a broken old man but as a father who had chosen truth as his weapon, a weapon no one in that room could deny. The silence that followed the revelation was unlike anything I had ever experienced, for it was not the silence of peace but the silence of disbelief, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against every wall of the courtroom. And as I turned my eyes toward my children, I saw the weight of truth crash into them with a force no argument could withstand. My daughter's face drained of all color, as though the life had been pulled from her, her lips trembling as she tried to form words that never came, and my son sat frozen, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting between me, the judge, and the man they had defended with such certainty. And though I had imagined this moment in countless restless nights, nothing could prepare me for the sight of their arrogance crumbling into fear, for just hours before they had entered this courtroom with pride, their voices firm as they spoke against me. But now those voices were silenced by the very evidence that revealed the depth of their mistake, and I watched my daughter slowly turn her gaze to her husband, searching for an explanation, searching for denial, searching for anything that could erase what she had just heard. But he offered her nothing, only a clenched jaw and a silence that betrayed his guilt more than any words ever could. And my son, who had once laughed with him outside that window while mocking me, now stared at him with the look of a man realizing he had been played, his eyes wide with a sudden understanding that his trust had been weaponized against his own blood. And I could see the storm of emotions building in them, the shock, the confusion, the dawning horror that they had turned on their father for a man who had deceived them all along. And though part of me wanted to feel pity, part of me wanted to reach across that divide and remind them of the love I still carried. Another part of me could not ignore the deep satisfaction of watching the lies unravel, for this was not my doing alone. This was the truth rising to the surface where it always belonged, and the courtroom itself mirrored their shock, the spectators whispering fiercely, some gasping audibly, the clerk fumbling with papers, and even the judge leaning forward with eyes sharper than before, clearly recognizing the magnitude of what had been revealed. And as I sat there quietly, I let them feel the full weight of that silence, for there was nothing I could say in that moment that would strike harder than the reality staring them in the face, the reality that their father, whom they had dismissed and disowned, was not the fool they imagined, but the keeper of a truth they could never deny. And though my children finally looked at me, their eyes searching mine for something, perhaps forgiveness or perhaps explanation, I met their gaze with calm resolve, neither triumphant nor broken, but steady, reminding them without words that it was they who had chosen this path, and now they were standing in the wreckage of their own decisions. And I will never forget the way my daughter's hands began to shake as she lowered her head into them, tears spilling through her fingers, nor the way my son leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping as though he had been carrying a weight he did not realize until it crushed him. And in that instant the arrogance was gone, the bravado dissolved, leaving only two children who had realized too late the depth of the truth. And though the pain of their betrayal still cut through me, I knew the moment of reckoning had finally begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the truth settled over the courtroom, like a storm cloud refusing to lift, all eyes slowly turned to the man who had once strutted through these proceedings with smug confidence. And, for the first time since this battle began, I saw the mask of arrogance crack on my son-in-law's face, his lips pressed tightly together as though he could force silence to undo the evidence, his hands fidgeting against the polished wood of the table, his posture no longer the relaxed lean of a victor, but the stiff and nervous stance of a man cornered by reality. And though he tried to hold the gaze of the judge, his eyes betrayed him, darting across the room, searching for escape, searching for some way to undo the undeniable proof that lay before us. And when the judge asked him directly if he wished to respond, his voice faltered, the smooth, rehearsed tone replaced with a stammering denial, claiming the documents were taken out of context, that the money transfers meant nothing, that the accusations of another child were lies. But each excuse rang hollow against the mountain of evidence stacked before him, and as the whispers from the spectators grew louder, he raised his voice, desperate now, pointing his finger at me and shouting that I was a bitter old man inventing stories to save myself. But the judge quickly silenced him, reminding him that the documents spoke louder than accusations, and I sat quietly watching as the walls he had built around himself began to collapse brick by brick, his confidence crumbling in real time, while my children looked at him not with admiration but with grace, owing disgust. My daughter's tear-stained face twisted with betrayal as she demanded in a choked whisper if it was true, if he had lied to her for years, and his silence answered her better than words ever could. His eyes refusing to meet hers as he slumped deeper into his chair, and my son clenched his fists, leaning toward him with anger boiling in his voice, telling him that he had ruined everything, that he had dragged them into this war only to be exposed as a fraud. And for a brief moment I saw in my son's face the boy he once was, furious not at me but at the man who had poisoned his loyalty. And though I felt no joy watching the collapse unfold, I could not deny the sense of justice, for arrogance had been replaced with fear, deceit had been replaced with exposure, and the man who believed himself untouchable was now nothing more than a liar unraveling before an entire court, his shoulders sagging, his hands covering his face as the weight of the revelation crushed him. And when the judge pressed again for an explanation, his words spilled out like a dam breaking, incoherent excuses, half-truths, contradictions that only deepened his guilt, until finally his own lawyer placed a hand on his arm to quiet him, recognizing that every word was digging him deeper into ruin. And in that moment the silence that followed was different, no longer heavy with disbelief, but sharp with judgment. For everyone in that room had seen the mighty fall, and as I watched him crumble under the weight of his lies, I understood that this was not just about property or money, this was about truth prevailing over manipulation, about seeing arrogance stripped bare until nothing remained but the hollow shell of a man who had tried to destroy me and failed. And though my children sat beside him in stunned silence, I knew they too saw him for what he truly was. And perhaps for the first time they realized that siding with him had not only cost them their dignity, but had also revealed to them the kind of man their father had always been. A man who fought not with lies, but with patience, with resilience, and with the power of undeniable truth. When the storm of evidence and humiliation finally broke apart and the silence returned to the courtroom, it was not the judge who spoke first, nor the lawyers who shuffled their papers in preparation for what came next. It was my children, my very own flesh and blood, their voices trembling as they turned to me, not with accusations this time, but with desperation. My daughter's eyes red and swollen from the tears that refused to stop falling as she whispered across the table, asking me to forgive her, telling me that she had been blinded, that she had believed the lies her husband had fed her, and her words spilled out in a rush, half sobs, half pleas, promising that she never meant to hurt me, that she thought she was protecting her future, that she thought she was fighting for security when in reality she had been tearing apart the very man who had built that security with his bare hands. And my son, usually so proud and stern, bowed his head like a child once more, his voice breaking as he admitted that he had been wrong, that he had let his greed cloud his judgment, that he had forgotten the years of sacrifice that had carried him to where he stood today, and he begged me to understand, to give him a chance to make amends, to allow him to stand once more, not as an enemy across the courtroom, but as a son beside his father. And though part of me longed to rush to them, to gather them in my arms as I once did when they were children, crying from scraped knees or broken hearts, another part of me remained still, because forgiveness is not a word spoken lightly. It is a bridge, rebuilt slowly, brick by brick, after the fire of betrayal has burned it to the ground. And so I looked at them, my face calm though my heart ached, and I told them in a voice steady and deliberate that forgiveness may come with time, but trust, once broken, does not return the same. And I saw the pain of those words cut through them, my daughter clutching her chest as though the air had been taken from her, my son nodding slowly with tears streaming down his face. And yet I knew it was the truth, for to simply erase what they had done would be to diminish the years of suffering I had endured in silence. And as the judge watched this exchange with solemn eyes, I felt the entire courtroom shift, for this was no longer only about property or legal battles. This was about a family torn apart by greed, struggling now to find footing in the rubble of their own mistakes. And though my children pleaded for my forgiveness, though their voices cracked and their tears fell freely, I remained composed, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because they had to understand that actions carry consequences, that words spoken in arrogance cannot be undone by words spoken in regret. And while I did not shut the door entirely, I made it clear that the road back to me, to my heart, would be long and uncertain. And as they sat there broken, I could see that the lesson had finally begun to take root, that the arrogance which once blinded them had been replaced by the humility of realizing that love cannot be taken for granted. And though the wound they left in me would never truly heal, I allowed a small part of me to hope that perhaps in time they would find their way back. But for now I remained firm, reminding them with silence as much as with words that forgiveness is a gift that must be earned, not demanded. When the final day of arguments ended and the courtroom settled into that anxious quiet that always comes before judgment, I felt my entire life hanging in the balance, every sacrifice, every humiliation, every night of grief compressed into the few moments it took for the judge to shuffle the papers before him and clear his throat. And though my children sat across from me with faces pale and weary from the truth that had already unraveled their illusions, and though my son-in-law slumped in his chair a shadow of the arrogant man he once pretended to be, I kept my eyes fixed on the bench where justice was about to speak. And when the judge finally began, his words were steady and deliberate, carrying a weight that filled the room and silenced even the whispers of the spectators. And he declared that the evidence laid before him left no doubt that the accusations against me were unfounded, that I had not mismanaged my estate, but had in fact been the victim of manipulation and fraud. And he ruled not only in my favor, but with a stern reprimand to those who had sought to use the court as a weapon of greed. And in that moment I felt a rush of vindication unlike anything I had ever known, as though the decades of sacrifice that had been ignored, the love that had been trampled, and the dignity that had been stripped away were all returned to me in an instant, restored by the power of truth that no lie could ever bury forever. And I looked at my children, their eyes downcast, their lips trembling, their pride shattered by the reality of their own choices. And I looked at the man who had orchestrated it all, now pale and sweating, his lawyer whispering frantically into his ear while he stared blankly at the floor. And I understood that this was not only a victory for me, it was a reckoning for them. For the judge's ruling came with consequences beyond words. Consequences that meant my estate was protected, my authority intact, and their attempts to strip me of dignity had collapsed into ashes. And even more than that, the fraud uncovered meant that my son-in-law would now face investigations, potential charges that could strip him of the very freedom he had used to torment me. And as the gavel struck to close the session, the sound echoed in my chest, like the tolling of a bell announcing the end of a long and brutal war. And I felt my shoulders loosen, my breath steady, my heart lighter than it had been in years, because I had walked into that courtroom as a man accused, humiliated, disowned by his own blood, but I was walking out vindicated, my dignity restored, and though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, I carried with me the certainty that justice had prevailed, that truth had triumphed, and that the man they thought too weak to fight back had stood taller than all of them when it mattered most. And as I left the courtroom, people stepped aside in silence, some nodding in respect, others whispering about the strength it must have taken to endure what I had endured, and for the first time in years I felt not invisible, not dismissed, but seen. Seen for the father I had always been, for the man who had kept his vows, and for the survivor who had faced the storm and emerged stronger. And though my children trailed behind me in tears, and though my son-in-law was surrounded by the shadows of his ruin, I stepped forward with my head high, carrying not bitterness but vindication, knowing that what had been taken from me in pain had been returned in truth. When the dust finally settled and the courtroom was nothing more than a memory etched into my mind, I found myself sitting once more in the quiet of my home, the same walls that had witnessed decades of sacrifice, love, struggle, and pain, now echoing with a stillness that felt different. Not the suffocating silence of grief, but the steady calm of vindication. And as I sat there, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point, I realized that what I had endured was not simply a battle over property or inheritance. It was a battle for my dignity, for the truth of my life's work, for the very identity of a father who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. And though my children had disowned me in the most public and cruel way imaginable, though they had turned their backs on me and allowed greed to poison the bond that should have been unbreakable, I had chosen not to answer with rage, but with patience, with strategy, and with the one weapon none of them could deny, the truth. And in doing so, I had reminded not only them but myself that resilience does not fade with age, that strength is not measured in wealth, but in the endurance of a man who refuses to surrender to lies. And as I looked back on the sacrifices of my past, the nights of labor, the tears shed over my children's happiness, and the vow I had made to my wife as she slipped away, I realized that I had kept my promise in the only way that mattered, by protecting the truth even when it cost me everything else. And though forgiveness may take years, though trust may never be fully restored, I no longer carried the burden of wondering if I had failed, because the truth had spoken louder than their accusations and had returned my dignity in full. And I understood then that I did not need their validation, I did not need their praise, for I had already proven to myself and to the world that love and truth will always outlast greed and deceit. And as I closed my eyes, I felt the presence of my wife beside me, as if she too had witnessed the outcome, as if she were reminding me that the vow I made to her was not in vain, that I had carried it through the storm to the very end. And in that moment I felt a peace deeper than any I had known in years, a peace born not of revenge but of justice, not of destruction but of truth revealed. And though the scars of betrayal will remain etched on my heart, they no longer define me, for I am defined by the endurance of a father who refused to be erased, by the strength of a man who chose to stand tall when it would have been easier to fall. And as I sit here sharing my journey with you, I do so not with bitterness, but with the hope that my story will remind others that no matter how heavy the storm, truth will always have its day, and when it comes, it will not whisper, it will roar, and it will bring with it the dignity that no lie can steal. And for that, I am grateful, I am at peace, and I am ready to close this chapter, knowing that I have spoken not just for myself, but for every parent who has ever given more than they had to children who forgot the cost. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.